Did Jesus tell the woman at the well that she was a sinner? Hell to the no. You see, the Bible rarely says what evangelicals tell you it does. Let me explain why in today's Snarky Bible Story. I like to take a first century text, understand what's actually happening in the text, and then port the morality into the 21st century so we can actually know who Jesus was and what was happening with the people he interacted with. So today, I want to tell you the story of Jesus and the woman at the well, and why the way evangelical Christians use the story as a condemning story of sinners is totally effing wrong. And hey, before we get rolling, would you do me a favor? Hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Help me grow this channel. Listen to our Evangelicalish podcasts, and let's make this a thing on YouTube. Jesus is traveling around with his disciples, and he wants to get away from all of his the people around that are a lot like evangelicals today. They like to tell him what a false prophet he is. And so he goes to where the non-religious people are. The Jewish people called the place Sychar, which meant drunken. And it's kind of a put down because they didn't like the sort of half Jewish people, the Samaritans. But Jesus went there to kind of get away from his own people because he's like, I'm sick of these people. And so he comes to this town. He sends his disciples off to go get some food, and he sits down at the well. It's the middle of the day. He knows nobody's going to be coming to get water at the well, but suddenly, here comes this woman. And he's like, oh, crud. And here she comes. And women didn't come to get water in the middle of the day because it was too damn hot. And the women basically all went together in the morning when it was cool to get water together and, do whatever women did together in those days, if they gossiped or just told stories or did whatever. And so this woman coming at the middle of the day, any evangelical will tell you she was a woman of ill repute. But just because evangelicals tell you that somebody's a bad person doesn't mean they're a bad person. And just because they tell you this woman was a woman of ill repute doesn't mean that's so either. But she was there at an unusual time of day, and it may just be society said she was a bad person, and that's why she was off on her own. That doesn't mean she actually was a bad person. And Jesus addresses her and says, hey, will you draw me some water? And in the Bible story, we're told, she says, you, a Jew, are addressing me, a Samaritan. And see, on the paper, we see this statement and we just say it as fact. But I think what you can see happening in the text here is she's like snarky. I think this is why Jesus ends up having a conversation with him. She's like, oh, you, a Jewish man, are asking me, a Samaritan, for a drink. Aren't you afraid you'll get cooties if I give you water? I mean, I think she's being snarky as hell here. And I think Jesus is like, maybe he's like, is this woman for real? Because, men ruled the world, women were nothing. He's a Jew. They were superior. The Samaritans were nothing. And in that culture, a man was not even supposed to talk to a woman in public, even not his own mother or sister. And he is a teacher, not a rabbi. People say Jesus was a rabbi. Rabbis did not exist in first century Palestine. They didn't come along till after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Jesus was not a rabbi. He was a sage teacher, not a rabbi. But these teachers did not talk to women in public, and they wouldn't even look at a woman in public. They would close their eyes, and they were called the bruised ones because they would close their eyes to not see women in public that weren't out with their husband. And they would walk into buildings and stuff and have the bruises to prove how pure and holy they are, just like Christians in America today. Look how holy and pious I am. I won't even look upon the trans person or act like they exist. That's the religious people Jesus was dealing with. But he asks her to give him a drink. And then he's like, well, actually, if you knew who you were talking to, you would ask me for a drink. And she's like, well, you don't have a bucket or anything to draw water with. So who the heck are you? What are you talking about? So again, I think there's this gamesmanship starting to go on between the two. And he's like, well, I would give you living water and you would never be thirsty again. Now, she has some religious background because she then says, oh, are you greater than our father Jacob? Or they start having this interaction around Jacob. And she's acknowledging that as a Samaritan, she has a heritage similar to Jesus, that Jacob is the father of their lineage together, because she understands that living water is a term that relates to the idea of the Messiah, and the Messiah is someone who would come to liberate the Jews one day. And so she's like, oh, you're talking about the Messiah. I'm saying, are you greater than our father Jacob, who built this well that's here? And we do know from Hebrew scripture history that is a well that was dug by Jacob in history, and it's now this part of this town. So this is not acrimonious necessarily. These are two people sort of having this jaw fest together. And then the thing happens that evangelicals will tell you, see, she's a sinful woman and Jesus is calling out her sin, because evangelicals love that idea of go and sin no more. You got to tell people they're sinners. But Jesus says to her, go and get your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And I think she probably said it something like that. And he says, yeah, I know you don't have a husband because you've been married 5 times and now you're living with a man who is not your husband. So, aha, says the evangelical. See, she's an evil, slutty woman. She's a whore. But that is a misunderstanding of the culture. The culture that they were in at the time was that a husband could divorce a wife for any reason. There was a saying at the time that says, if your wife burns your toast, you can hand her a certificate of divorce that day. Women had no rights. And so a husband could divorce her for any reason. And then the second she was divorced, she had no right to access the economic system. She was used goods, of course, because she was no longer a virgin. And if her family didn't take her back, she was screwed. And so being married 5 times for a woman was not necessarily unusual, because women were used as possessions by men to turn out babies for them to get as farm workers. And then when they were done with them, out you go, woman. And so she probably had been mistreated by a lot of bad men. And then when Jesus says, and you're living with a man to whom you're not married, I don't think any man in that society would have taken her in as somebody to live with, other than a kinsman, much like the Boaz and Ruth story initially, that a kinsman probably took her in as a ward. So living with a man to whom you're not married is not necessarily a sinful statement. It's quite likely that she was living with somebody who was being kind to take her in. And her response to what he said is not, you're right, I'm a terrible person, I should be ashamed. No, her response is like, okay, I get it. You're a prophet. Like, you just told me something about my life that you couldn't have known. You're a prophet. I want to hear more. And she's like, your people say we should worship down in Jerusalem. My people say we should worship here. Who's right? And he's like, none of it is right. Both religions are wrong. And let me tell you why. And he starts to have this conversation. And the next thing you know is she leaves her water bucket there and she goes off to the town to tell people in the town, like, come meet the man who told me everything I've ever done. So what he told her about having 5 husbands and now living with a man that she isn't married to didn't put shame on her like Christians like to do on sinners. It told her that she needed to listen to what he had to say. And when she did, she then went and got all her friends and said, come meet the man who told me everything I had to say. And this is my challenge to you, Christians. When you condemn people for their sin, do they go get their friends and say, come meet this person and let them tell you how bad a sinner you are? Is that their response to you? I dare say rarely, if ever. And maybe that's because your representation of Christ is not really a representation of Christ. This woman I believe when you see this story, she was snarky as hell. Jesus said, "Oh, I like this woman. And we're going to have a little sparring match verbally." And at the end of it all, when he tells her, "Hey, I am the Messiah," she's like, "Oh, this is cool. Could this be him?" And she went to her friends and said, "He told me everything I'd ever done, and it didn't make me ashamed. It actually made life come into me. Could this be the Messiah?" And they all came and they were like, "Wow, he's really cool. We heard your witness and now we've listened to him and he's pretty amazing." And it said, Jesus and his disciples stayed there for 2 days, which was a tradition for a teacher. This village of Samaritans that the Jews hated, Jesus stayed for 2 days. And whenever a sage teacher came to a town, the people would put him and his entourage up, which would usually be pretty large. And then they would give them money and food and gifts and send them on their way. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening here. Jesus did not call her a sinner. He actually, I think, was like, "Wow, she's really cool." And she's like, "Okay, this guy's pretty amazing because he told me something he couldn't have known." And they became like little conversational sparring partners. And in the end, he won her over to a new life because he didn't look like a Christian. And Jesus was not a Christian. And he didn't come to bring the Christian religion. He came to bring a spirituality that connected people to their true identity in connection to something bigger than themselves and the divine. And that's exactly what Jesus did with the woman at the well. And she said, "Friends, you got to meet this guy because this is really cool."